Declaring a foreign key constraint with declarative schema XML is pretty straightforward. Let's create a reference to a website by adding a new website ID column to our table and adding a foreign key constraint to the website ID column of the store website table. To declare a foreign key constraint, we need to create a column with the same data type as the reference column. The store website table is declared in the module Magento store. So let's have a look at the db schema XML file in that module to check what we have to use. So here's vendor Magento. I'm looking for module store. There it is, etc db schema XML. So here's the table, store website, and the website ID column. First, let's check that the table is declared in the same database segment as our table. So this uses resource default. So we're good there. Very good. Now let's have a look at the column declaration. So we need a column with the same data type. So padding, unsigned, and nullable have to be the same. Identity, of course, we do not want to use a identity true column because we don't want an auto increment column. Anyway, this is pretty close, so I'll just copy this declaration and move it over into our file and set identity to false. Good. Now we can create the foreign key constraint. Okay, let's specify the type of the constraint to be a foreign key constraint. Good. And now we have to specify a reference ID. The reference ID for now will just take a temporary value. I'll talk a bit more about that later. And now we specify the column name from our table, which is website ID. And now we can specify the reference table. Store website, and the reference column, which is also website ID. And finally, we can specify the onDelete action. We'll just use cascade. Valid values for onDelete are cascade, set null, or no action. Now, let's have a look at this temporary reference ID value here. The reference ID value is, in fact, ignored when the constraint is created. The foreign key name will always be generated regardless of what we specify in the XML as the reference ID. But we can't leave it empty either because the schema requires us to add a value. So what we have to do is the following. We have to generate the table with a temporary constraint name, and then we'll later have to take the real generated name and update our db schema file accordingly. So in future, changes to this file can be applied correctly. This workflow is a bit strange, but in practice it works good enough. In the next video, we'll get the opportunity to update the reference ID in this declaration. For now, let's just leave it as this unique temporary value. In case there are multiple new foreign key constraints in a db schema, it's probably a good idea to use a unique reference ID value for each one of them. And before we wrap up this video, one last note. The XML schema allows to specify a table attribute on the constraint. In fact, many of the core code constraints include this table attribute. Not all of them, but many. So here, for example. Now, this table attribute is completely ignored. Because of that, I think it's best not to add it to the XML at all, because it could potentially lead to inconsistencies. And even though Magento ignores it, it still might confuse human readers.